Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Mark.
You believe it? We are in episode 5 already. It's quite incredible. From the last 4 episodes that we did, we have covered quite a fair bit. And I think today is really a nice way to end this short series because now it's really about the teachers really taking charge and control of their own development through evidence-based reflective practice. Maybe what you can do is walk us through what exactly does that mean and how exactly teachers can benefit from this.
Okay, let's have an anchor point here that firstly, reflective practice has been around a long time. I think I mentioned that at the end of the last episode, but
right.
the research hasn't shown that it's taken off in ways that have been particularly effective for improving teaching. And I think there's a reason for this. And I remember reading John Attie's book, and I took this quote out because it's very significant, I think, for where we went with our kind of research and development on reflective practice. And what he basically says is this current penchant, that's a very sort of John Attie style, I like that, for reflective teaching, too often ignores that such reflection is based on, it needs to be based on evidence and not post hoc justification. Now, that's a very clever way of putting the fact that it's not terribly evidence-based in what it does. Okay. So, if you remember, what we did is to say, well, hold on, if we know a lot more, and the research clearly shows that we know a lot more about teaching and learning, and Jeff Petty's work was landmark when he said, look, we are now moving away from fad and fashion to a kind of knowledge base where it can be like engineering or medicine. I don't think it's as near to evidence-based as that. Mind you, I mean, some of the medical practices are coming under a lot of criticism, aren't they? You know, when you look at COVID, we've got a science of this. Well, you know, I look at it and think, well, maybe I know as much as these guys. Anyway, let's get back to this. So this is the big point, that reflective practice must involve evaluation. Now, very often it's, oh, well, you've got to have a little look at yourself to improve, but people often like to see the good things and don't like to see the mistakes. I mean, there's lots of attribution biases. We tend to blame other people rather than ourselves. It's part of the way the mind typically works for many people. Unless you're aware of this and you work very hard, you're very metacognitive to overcome it. So the issue of evaluation on anything, whether you're buying phones, getting married, or, you know, whatever it is, if you're making some selection or some judgment on something, it must involve criteria and evidence sources. And very often when we make bad decisions on anything in life or teaching, it's because we haven't had the right criteria and we haven't got the right evidence sources, or we've not calibrated them. It always exists within that, because with the best criteria and the best evidence and good thinking, we should make the best decision. That doesn't always mean it works out perfectly. So this is a big point here, that evidence-based reflective practice as a framework, core principles of learning, that are evidence-based heuristics. They are the criteria. Those core principles are criteria, so that we're able to look at student learning outcomes in terms of engagement and attainment. Are the students actually attaining what we expect? Are they actually engaged for any given instructional episode? And this applies universally, because that's the nice thing about evidence-based creative teaching. It applies universally, and it gives us the capability to frame key evidence of student attainment. In other words, well, what are we actually really looking for that's important in student attainment? Well, obviously that they are meeting the performance standards, that the students are able to actually do what we want them to do on authentic tasks. And that's very important, because we don't want to give students activity for activity's sake. We want to make sure that they really are developing key understandings and key skills. That's really important, that are relevant to the core sort of vocational area. And we can measure engagement. Do they look engaged? Well, they might look engaged, but they might not be actually cognitively engaged or emotionally engaged. So we can actually measure all these different types of engagement and agentic. And that's an important aspect of engagement, courtesy of the work of Professor Reeve, who's done a lot of work in that area. And that is, are the students actually asking questions? Are they showing that they're taking some locus of control over their learning. So what we're saying is, in evidence-based reflective practice, we have the criteria, we know what we're looking for, and we're aware of the types of evidence that are really meaningful. So in a nutshell, and this is really it in summary, is that teaching faculty, teachers, trainers, what they can do is make better, more valid inferences about their lessons and all the components of the lesson in terms of, if I design the lesson this way from an evidence-based point of view, using the technologies, I'm more likely to get better outcomes. In other words, the students will actually learn the outcomes and they won't be bored stiff. So that's pretty good. Don't expect students every lesson to be ecstatic and excited about your learning. There's always more interesting things to do than sit in lessons, in most cases. Anyway, and also, as well as to diagnose the lesson afterwards, you know, what Sean referred to as reflection in action. But the big point is, you've got to look at your lesson and say, well, this worked because there's an evidence-based reason that the students didn't appear confused because I had an advanced organizer that worked and I had clear goals, not post-op justification. And if you look at that little caption there, it could have been a man or a woman as a doctor. So if anybody's watching, look, this is just purely an illustration. Don't focus on that bit. But the patient is saying to the doctor, I love this, I've already diagnosed myself on the web. You know, this kind of idea that you go on the web and you become an instant expert. But I thought I'd come in for a second opinion. So, I mean, post-op justification's a bit, and this is scary, that there's too many people who think they read a little bit somewhere and suddenly, because it's on the internet, that, you know, they're instant experts. It's kind of worrying. And me and you have worked with hundreds, thousands of teaching professionals, and sometimes you say to them, how did the lesson go? And I remember a number of them say, oh, I think it went okay. And then when I say to them, well, what went okay? They say, well, I covered the 54 slides. I'm like, yeah, you did. But like, I observed after 5 minutes, I might not say it like this, it's not a terribly good thing to say, but I observed, I'm thinking to myself, well, 95% were disengaged and there's 60 plus students in the classroom. So something wasn't working. And then when you start asking them what went well after that, well, okay, you covered, you went through 54 slides. What else? Well, what do you mean, what else? It was like, hey. So, you know, that's the kind of worry. And I think that was John Attie's point about a lot of people are just not using any evidence-based approach. And as a result is, yeah, it went all right, it might have been better, maybe it's the time of day. You know, they'll find reasons why the students didn't learn. Or often people say, oh, we remember this, out of sync students. Well, what does that mean, out of sync? You know, it means that they're not, you know, not motivated, they shouldn't be on this program. Well, then you can always turn around and say, why am I making any effort teaching if they're not going to learn anyway? It becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it has a dangerous component to it as well. Okay, just to give you an example here, we developed a number of tools, but they're all around the common theme of what are our key criteria here. And this is the generic one that we use for teachers. And it's simply, on the left, the core principles of learning. And then what the teacher, lecturer does is to say, well, hold on, well, did I communicate this? How did I do it? Oh, well, I had an advanced organizer. And then they might say, did I activate prior knowledge? Now, it might be that in any lesson, not all of these core principles apply. And the idea that we got across the staff that is so important to anybody, this is not a form-filling exercise. When it's used administratively rather than pedagogically, teachers don't like it. And I understand that, because sometimes you think, well, I didn't get them thinking today, there was no need. So why have I got to fill in something? So the important thing is this becomes something that teachers use for their own self-reflection, but evidence-based. It's not about filling the boxes in, it's about being very precise and openly critical about what you're doing, but also very positive. So you can actually put in there all positive things and say it worked. And if it did, well, that's great. We're not looking to catch teachers out. So that's the first part of it. And the second part of it is just a continuation of the core principles. So that was a very simple tool. But if you're teaching specific things like intrinsic motivation, you can actually put in other criteria. Was the teacher autonomy supporting? was the teacher developing mastery? As long as you're very clear about what you're looking for, and what you're looking for is evidence-based. When we did the research on intrinsic motivation, self-determination theory that we used along as part of our evidence-based approach is in itself evidence-based approach. Self-determination theory probably has the best cognitive science validation of theories of human motivation. And again, people can say, well, what techniques am I using? How am I behaving that is encouraging students to be autonomous? How is it encouraging them to develop mastery? So that's the basic thing. And just the last thing, there's just, we collected dozens and dozens of these over the research that we did. And again, what was interesting, that our researchers were all very experienced teachers, but they found using the evidence-based reflective practice tool, right, this is just a tool based on that, really useful. And if you ever get round to reading the recent book, there's some in there, and there's nice quotes. All of the researchers felt in some way it improved our ability to diagnose aspects of the lesson more thoughtfully, and identified areas where they could still improve even though they'd won teaching awards. So it had good validation. So that's basically the evidence-based reflective practice tool, which is simply a heuristic from evidence-based creative teaching.
So for me, I think it's quite useful, because now it gives me a guide or frame to really focus on developing my creative teaching competence. And with, you know, with all the series that we have talked about, the importance of building that competence. And again, I think that's where I've now used, for me personally, I've used the tool to remind myself once in a while and to keep myself honest, so to speak, on looking at the way I'm doing some things and the way I'm doing my teaching, so that when I reflect, I'm able to provide real, and I use the word loosely, real evidence and artifacts of what I'm actually doing. So it gives me something to chew on.
Yeah, well, that's such a good point. In fact, just to pick up on that, teachers should not be afraid of doing evidence-based reflective teaching using these kind of tools, because that way, if they are doing that and in an appraisal situation, if people say, oh, well, you're not getting students engaged, you can use the tool. Plus, if you collect feedback, and what we can virtually guarantee that teachers who can teach in creative teaching competence term and use this tool, they get great feedback. So it's very well validated. So it gives you actually not just professional development capability, but it helps you to provide evidence that you are actually doing good reflective practice from an evidence-based point of view on your teaching. So it benefits all aspects of professional development and the dialogue between, if you like, teaching personnel who are involved in appraisal. But this is nothing worse than being appraised and someone says, I don't think that lesson was very good. And when you say, well, what was not good about it? And they just say, I don't think it was interesting enough, or I didn't like this. This really makes it as near as possible more or less subjective, certainly, and more objective based on our best way of framing good teaching in a flexible way, but again, with a reasonable degree of scientific basis. That last quote I put up is something I think that when we go on to make other series, like the one we're going to do on metacognitive capability and self-directed learning, is the longer term objective is teachers have creative teaching competence. In other words, they are expert, adaptive experts in the sense that we've talked about it in this series, but also that we teach our students how to learn. We teach them the science of learning, if you like, the core principles contextualized to their context. Because what we want to have in the classroom is a kind of language of learning based on these core principles. So if students say to us in the afternoon, they turn around and say, chair, I love using that Singaporeanism, that they love turning around and saying, oh, we're bored now. Well, okay, well, if they're bored, and so well, what are you bored with? And they say, look, we've had too much cognitive overload this morning, you know, so now can we digest it? So that they can actually tell us that, well, I don't think I've got a good enough neural network on this. Can you give me another story, another analogy? So we actually use a language of learning, and that will make teaching and learning much more of a effective, efficient and engaging enterprise, and also build that great rapport and trust between, you know, teachers and students, that the job here is to help all of us learn, and particularly you to meet your objectives, and for us to develop ourselves as human beings and enjoy doing it. So it makes perfectly sense that this is something that we should be doing with our students, getting them to be self-directed. But again, they're only going to become self-directed if they know how to do it from an evidence-based point of view.
Okay, so that's perfect. That, I think, really brings us to the end of our short little 5-episode series. I enjoyed doing them. I hope you did. So for everyone who would like to know a little bit more about, not only just for today's episode on reflective practice, but for the other episodes that we did as well, you can always get in touch with Dennis at dennis.sale@gmail.com, or you can check out his website at www.dennissale.com. And once again, so let me thank you formally again, Dennis. I enjoyed myself. And I think we are now going to look at some other aspects of teaching and learning, that maybe you can give our viewers a little bit of a preview of what we are going to do next. So what are we going to do next, Dennis?
Well, I think tying in with this, there's two big areas of competence that are going to be fundamental for expert teachers today and in the foreseeable future. One is creative teaching competence that we've covered in this series. That is, you know, such a fundamental, if you like, functional competence to teachers. So if you can, if you have creative teaching competence and you can do all the technical aspects of different methods, etc., you are pretty much on the right track, and using evidence-based reflective practice as the driving professional development vehicle. Now, the other big area, and this is going to be such a dominant thing, not just in education, but across society, because we talk about 21st century skills or competencies, and people talk about communication, collaboration, teamwork, creativity as 21st century skills. Well, I would suggest, and I agree with, I think it's Robert Shank, who said that, look, these skills are first century skills, that when we lived in the caves, didn't we have to work together to keep the saber-toothed tiger out from eating our children? You know, it's just become more complicated, but the big 21st century competency is in fact metacognition. Now, because metacognition is about understanding how the mind works, how the brain works, and how we can try to self-regulate better. In terms of how do we think better, which means to think better, we've got to monitor our thinking. How do we kind of manage our emotions in a very frustrating, challenging world? We talk about emotional intelligence. That's part of self-regulation. It's part of metacognition. And also, how do we kind of critically look at our belief systems and how they impact the way we see things? So a big area of learning, students, if they're going to be self-directed, they need to learn how to learn, which means involving knowledge about how they think and how they can improve their thinking and manage their thinking, how they can manage themselves when they're challenged with so many different opinions, so many different perceived threats in the environment, and also develop the resilience. People talk about grit. It's true that we are going to have to equip our kids and ourselves as teachers with an ability to be more self-regulated and more self-directed. So I refer to that overall thing because there's so much jargon. There's metacognition, there's meta-learning, there's self-regulated learning. I use the term metacognitive capability, and that's the ability to use our heads, knowing that in our brains not everything works perfectly together, but we have some ability to at least self-regulate better, so we can learn better, so we can experience better well-being. So that's the next big series. So if you're happy to do these intercontinental interviews, we can do that over the next few weeks. Post that. Given the importance of technology, the episode that we did here, we can do a larger, we can do an whole series on that if you think it's useful.
Okay, so thank you for that. That's a lot to unpack. But I think we can safely say that we will be back soon to unpack this idea of metacognitive ability, which I think you refer to as the superordinate competence for the 21st century. And we will do that. And I think we will also really get some other people, like people who have worked with experts who might be very good at metacognition, for them to also share with us a little bit more about what they have been doing in that field. So thank you again, Dennis, for sharing